What do you mean I can't do brain surgery on my father? Yeah. So, the man who has himself as his lawyer has a fool for a client, and I'm sure that one of our panel members might want to discuss that further later, Adam. So look, the Medical Council has released a new statement on treating yourself and those close to you back in October last year. Now, we've had a steady stream of statements released by the Council on this topic, and up until now, the pattern seems to have been for increasingly tighter restrictions. So it was with some trepidation, but then surprise and a little bit of relief that I read the new statement. Look, more on detail on that coming up. Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for clinicians in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. My name is Dr. Tim Cookson, and I'm a consultant to MPS. I'm joined by my very experienced and expert colleagues, Dr. Sam King and Dr. Lucy Gibbard. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Tim.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Tim.
And also Adam Holloway, an equally experienced and expert lawyer from Watton and Kearney, the legal firm with whom we work. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Tim.
So for those of us who have been around for a while, there's been a lot of movement by council in this area over the years. So when I started in practice, it was possible to get an APC which allowed you, when you retired, to continue to prescribe for both yourself and your family. And in fact, this was only removed within the last 15 years. And it's definitely not the case now that you can prescribe for yourself and your family. So Sam and Lucy, the basic principle of not treating yourself, family or friends has sort of been established in New Zealand for quite a few years now. And surely all doctors in New Zealand know this. So, are we still getting cases on a semi-regular basis like we used to about this issue? And if so, can you give us any examples?
I would say we are definitely still getting cases on treating yourself and those close to you. Gosh, I'm thinking of examples. It generally is about prescribing repeats of medications, can be very common, or things that the doctor has considered to be pretty minor. And there are definitely some doctors out there who it's a great surprise to them that they're not allowed to do it. I also think it's been a bit commoner that the pharmacists are very aware of the council statements now, and it seems to be quite regular that it's actually the pharmacists who are reporting.
I'm aware of one chain of pharmacies where I think it's part of their policy that doctors are not allowed to prescribe for themselves, and therefore notifications are made. That chain I shall not mention the name of, but there you go. Interestingly, I'm aware that a junior doctor has told me during induction at a particular hospital that they're working in, that they were told that they can prescribe for one another, that the new house officers are allowed to prescribe for one another, which I was quite surprised at. So I don't think it's necessarily widespread knowledge, Tim.
And I think there's also a lot of international medical graduates here, and the rules over the rest of the world aren't always the same. And so there are definitely some countries where it's kind of expected that you're going to look after your family. And then those doctors come to New Zealand and it's actually a really big shock to them that that's not what you do here.
And a while ago, I did a bit of a search around all of the jurisdictions that I could find. And yeah, there's a huge variation. And at the time, New Zealand had by far the most draconian rules of any other country that I could find. And some, it's expected. Germany, it's absolutely fine. Singapore, it used to be absolutely fine as well. Though they did in Singapore say you shouldn't do major surgery on one of your family without, thinking carefully about it.
Major surgery. So you shouldn't do the brain surgery.
Not the brain surgery, but the hip replacement's fine. Yeah.
Good to know. I'll remember that.
Yeah.
The reality is, though, we are still getting plenty of cases about this where doctors are reported to the Medical Council.
Right. So this is not something that's known by all our members out there. Okay, so look, we're still getting the cases, but surely, and this is another area that I looked at some time ago and couldn't find any evidence on, I couldn't find any papers that showed that friends, family, even self, received worse care when the prescriber was themselves or the family member. There just didn't seem to be anything in the literature. So if that's the case, and you can't show from a good study that there's been harm as a result of this policy, I can understand why the policy is there. There's a certain logic behind it, but as far as I could find in my research, there was no actual evidence. So if that's the case, then surely most of these cases will just get an educational letter, and the council will say, look, we've noticed you're doing this, don't do it again because it's against our statements, and that nothing further will happen. So, Adam, am I wrong here? Are there cases where this behaviour has resulted in or been part of formal disciplinary action in the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal, the HPDT?
Yeah, there certainly are, Tim. So when a notification comes into the council, and it is mostly prescribing, where the council's been informed that a doctor has prescribed for themselves or their family, at a minimum at that point, the council will go to the Ministry of Health and do a wider search to get a feel for the scope of the conduct. I can't remember a recent case where they've focused exclusively on the instance of prescribing that's been reported. So the first thing that will happen is they'll see whether this is part of a pattern, whether there are other family members involved, or this is prescribing that's gone on for a while. There's then an opportunity to try and persuade the council that it is minor and should result in nothing more than a telling off, rather than be referred for formal disciplinary investigation. In my experience, it really does have to be at the minor end, very minor end of the scale to only get a warning letter. It's more common, I would say, than not for at least a full disciplinary investigation to occur. And that's possibly a function that, I don't know, prescribing paracetamol doesn't get reported. But of the ones that get reported, certainly a healthy proportion of those will go on for formal investigation. In terms of the next step, whether those investigations result in formal disciplinary charges before the tribunal, historically, the cases that have involved self-prescribing or prescribing to family have always been tied up with other conduct. So we've had doctors who have been penalised for treating themselves or treating family members, but in combination with some other aspect of dishonesty or other disreputable conduct that's caused this charge to be brought, and then they throw in the self-care as well. We have now at least 2 cases working their way through where it is just the self-prescribing or prescribing to family or providing care, not in combination with any dishonesty around who the prescription is for. So that's a shift, and it does show that the professional conduct committees who did those investigations thought that there must be a threshold that's reached beyond which they will regard breaches of the professional statement on not providing care to yourself or those close to you, where breaches of that will justify disciplinary action in its own right.
Were those cases related to volume or the particular type of medication they were prescribing for themselves? What was the aggravating factor, if you like?
Yes, I don't have the cases in front of me, Sam, to remember the fine grain of the specifics, but it is inevitably cases where the sort of medications being prescribed or the sort of treatment that's being engaged in will be regarded as more serious. So medicines with a potential for misuse or addiction are high on the list, and providing, in essence, psychiatric care or medicines intended to treat mental unwellness will be looked upon very poorly. And so even if you get formally investigated by a PCC. If what you've been doing is, I don't know, medication for skin conditions or acne or something, you're more likely to end up with a stern telling off. But if you are treating your spouse or young adult child for their depression, then you're sailing pretty close to the wind, and experience suggests at some point you'll cross over the line and may face a charge.
Interesting.
I was certainly involved some years ago with the former type of case that you're referring to, where there was one particular thing that was the precipitant, if you like, for the charge, and then the PCC went digging and digging and digging and digging, and it ended up with a 2 weeks tribunal hearing, which is a long time to spend in front of a tribunal. And although the original allegation, which was inappropriate prescribing of a narcotic, the case was actually fairly clear-cut. After the digging, the PCC then alleged that there were a whole lot of other prescribing issues, and the tribunal duly found him guilty on those charges as well. Now, what was interesting about that, and fortunate for our member, was that when we looked at the decisions, we really didn't agree with them. And so MPS appealed to the High Court, and virtually all of those decisions were overturned by the High Court. So, there may be the tribunals may be taking a harder line than what the courts do on the basis of that particular case. So look, thanks, Adam. It's clearly not just a tut-tut offence. So this is clearly a statement that can't be ignored by our members. The Council and the HPDT clearly take it seriously. And so it's worth our while spending a bit more time looking at this revised statement. So when a previous version of the statement was being discussed in Council, rumour has it that a senior medical member of the Council said something along the lines of, if my son tells me at the international airport just before we leave for the USA that he's forgotten his Ventolin inhaler, and I write a prescription to be filled at the airport chemist, that this would then be in breach of the statement that was being produced, and was apparently quite surprised when he was told that definitely it would be a breach. So look, we need some good news. So Sam, can you tell us what the new statement says in relation to urgent situations?
Yeah, sure. So the statement says, if circumstances exist where there is no practical alternative but to treat yourself or those close to you, you must provide best practice care consistent with what you would provide any other patient with the same condition and under similar circumstances.
So do you think this would help our colleague at the Council? And any other thoughts on this change?
Yes, I was quite heartened when I read the new statement. I thought actually they've softened it. It's not as harsh or draconian. And so it really comes down to what they mean by no practical alternative, and they haven't defined that. And because we haven't had any cases yet, I think we can discuss it, and I think it's worth a discussion, but we don't know where Council will settle on that or where PCC might settle on that.
But the situation where the Ventolin's needed, there's no real alternative but for the doctor to write the prescription. He might have a reasonable chance. Lucy, do you think he's going to get off?
I think he might. I think a slightly better chance than he had with the old statement. But I agree with Sam. It's that practical alternative thing, and I do wonder, with the availability of telehealth and other avenues, that actually they're going to always say, "Oh, but there's always a practical alternative." We don't know.
Well,
Yes.
in the past, they have said that just because there's a 6-hour wait in the local A&M in order to get your prescription for Panadol, say, that's not a reasonable excuse. And I would hope that they might have shifted on that.
Yeah, I don't know. Because it is an alternative that is what is required of every other member of the population to wait for 6 hours if they want a script,
So it's an equity issue?
So why should doctors, abuse their professional status by being able to?
Do you think that's an
that?
abuse of our professional status?
I would say, interestingly, I say that because I remember a case, and it was many years ago now, where a doctor was criticised for writing a script for pine-tarsol, which is just a liquid you put in your bath when you're itchy, that you could buy from the supermarket. And he was told that it was, inappropriate and an appropriate use of his professional status to do it. So I think it's possible.
I think taking a step back, this new statement is better expressed and easier to understand and work with, arguably a bit more lenient, and certainly there are things in here that if a doctor were faced with a complaint and getting some assistance from a lawyer in relation to that, there's material here we can work with to try and persuade the council to not elevate this to a formal investigation, or if it's an investigation, not elevate this to a charge. But if you are thinking about your appetite for risk as a doctor, I think a sensible starting position would be not to either treat yourself or anyone close to you. And if you're put in the position where that's being asked of you or you're considering it, take a moment to think, is there really no other way for me to address this situation? Is it genuinely an emergency, or am I contemplating this because it is going to be convenient, or it's going to be something that my loved one is expecting of me because they don't want to wait the 3 or 4 days it'll take to get an appointment with the GP, or don't want to wait on the phone for a script through telehealth. I mean, it would always be my advice, you don't do it unless you really, really have to, because even if this is arguably more lenient, you don't, any interaction with, engagement with the medical council that's springboarded off a notification is a very unhappy and stressful experience.
Yeah, no one feels happy about that letter that arrives from the medical council. So I think, and to take that further, we certainly wouldn't want our members to see any apparent softening as suddenly being a carte blanche that it's fine to go ahead and just prescribe willy-nilly. That would clearly be incredibly unwise.
It would be interesting for us, useful, I think, to discuss this with council, one of our stakeholder meetings, to ask what their intent was, whether it is, as you say, Adam, to clarify their stance up until now, or whether it is a softening. I think their stance up till now has been pretty strict.
But there's certainly an acknowledgement there, isn't there? There's one of the lines that says that there's a recognition that it's now actually very difficult to get a GP appointment. And so if they've put that in their documents, then, as you say, Adam, that does certainly give us some material to work with in terms of arguing a case for a member.
Indeed.
All right. Another area that seems to have had an amendment, a softening, is in the area of true emergencies. So, Lucy, thinking of emergencies, you're in your car and there's a crash. You've got your medical bag with you, so you've got stuff like morphine. You yourself are fine, but your very good friend who's in the car is badly injured and in need of effective pain relief until the ambulance arrives, which will be a while because you live in a remote area. What can you do?
Well, you have to believe there's another medical council statement that says you have an obligation to help in an emergency. So you kind of you may be stuck between a rock and a hard place, but actually this current statement's actually made it a little bit more clear for us. Paragraph 13G of the new statement says you must not prescribe or administer medication with a risk of addiction or misuse. So first of all, you think, well, that means I can't give my friend morphine. But fortunately, they've actually put in a specific exception in to paragraph 13, which allows a doctor to administer enough medication to meet any immediate needs. And I think, along with the statement on our obligations to help in an emergency, I think you're more likely to be criticised if you didn't help your friend. You know, if there's no other medical care available and they are in need of emergency treatment, I think you could definitely argue that that's what you should be doing.
So if the ambulance officer who turns up and you tell them immediately, I've given this amount of morphine to my friend, is shocked by that and thinks, well, that's not in accordance with the medical council statements, and rushes off to the council. Adam, do you think this revised statement will help Lucy in this situation?
Yeah, I think it's admirably clear that that's permitted and that there shouldn't be an issue with that. The way the statement works, if we think about it in terms of hierarchies, is there's a list of things in paragraph 13 that you must not ever do unless it is a genuine emergency.
And we'll list those later as well, because I think it's worthwhile covering those specifically.
Indeed,
Yep.
because they're the highest order of things to stay away from, unless you're in the car accident that poor Lucy has had. Underneath those list of must-nots, everything else is subject to the test of wherever possible, you should not treat yourself or those close to you. In circumstances where there are no practical alternatives, you may have to treat yourself or those close to you, but if you do so, then, and there's a list of things that you ought to do, such as take notes in the normal way, etc. So it divides treatment into those two classes: things you must not do except in an emergency, and things that you could contemplate if there's no practical alternative. And where the rubber will hit the road is unpacking over time through our experience with cases what the medical council regards as those words meaning. What is no practical alternative? Is it that it'll take me 6 weeks to get in somewhere and I don't want my loved one to have to wait that long? Is that no practical alternative? Or is it that there's simply no appointment available at all? The books are closed in your region. We're yet to find that out.
So just expand on that a wee bit more then, Adam. So how, in your experience, does the council differentiate, or does it, between a transgression of a should not versus a transgression of a must not in these statements?
I think a transgression of a should not is something that we're more likely to be able to resolve by way of a warning letter. A transgression of a must not would almost inevitably go on to a formal disciplinary investigation. Wouldn't necessarily go on to a disciplinary charge. There are plenty of cases where we've assisted doctors and met with PCCs and explained why it came to be that they were prescribing psychotropic medications to their spouse. For example, a recently arrived doctor from jurisdiction where that is absolutely run of the mill, and no one had taken them aside and explained the different approach here in New Zealand. So you won't necessarily get a disciplinary charge, but I think if you transgress a must not, you can expect to find yourself meeting with a professional conduct committee for sure.
And just to remind our members about that, if it's a two-stage process within the council, so there's a notifications triage team, which is a selection of members of the council who then look at the initial notification and decide whether any further action is taken. And from a practical point of view, if the matter ends with the NTT, that's relatively quick, relatively low level in comparison with anything else, it usually resolves with an educational type letter. Whereas if it goes on to the more investigative procedure, the professional conduct committee, that then becomes a lot more time-consuming, emotionally challenging, and that's where, as Adam has mentioned before, there's the potential for the PCC to start looking, and there may be other parts of your practice that then become exposed, which will then become the subject of further investigation. So there's a big difference between those two levels, isn't there?
A very significant difference. And the other one is that it is only the professional conduct committee process that has the potential to result in a disciplinary charge. So you either get it resolved at the low level or you go on to investigation, and then once you're being investigated, that carries with it at least the potential to face a disciplinary charge. And the assistance that we provide doctors is to engage with that investigation and meet with the PCC and account for your actions in a way that hopefully avoids charge being brought.
But the NTT, can they go to MedSafe and get the prescribing records before the decision to go to PCC?
They can and they will.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of one particular case where a doctor, the notification was about prescribing a week of antibiotics, and that ended up with a professional conduct committee hearing, because actually when they went and looked at the other prescribing, there was actually other prescribing as well. So even just the notification about it, giving a week of antibiotics to a family member, involved a full PCC.
Yeah, so as soon as a prescribing for yourself or someone close to you comes before the council, is notified to the council, as I said, they'll go to the Ministry of Health and get a spreadsheet which shows prescribing for people with your surname, for example, and consider that as to whether or not it provides a further reason to not resolve it at the lower level but refer it to investigation. But as Tim said, once the PCC gets hold of it, they can circle for a second bite back to the Ministry of Health, because by that stage they will have asked the doctor, you know, what are the surname of your mother-in-law, and they'll have a bigger list of people that they can go and hunt for. So what's a middle-sized problem can just continue to grow in scope as more information is covered by a PCC.
So the corollary is, if you've never prescribed anything else for the past year or two, you can prescribe something like paracetamol or antibiotics for a week. Is that what you're saying?
No. That's not the message we're giving.
Sorry, I'm being
okay, so that's good segue onto the next bit, which is where there has been a change, which is now allowing for intermittent management of minor ailments, treating yourself, family or friends. And as mentioned in the statement, especially considering the increasing difficulty in obtaining a GP appointment. The Council now says, exercise your professional and clinical judgment when managing one-off minor ailments that you or those close to you may have. And the definitions of what's one-off versus a chronic condition are covered a wee bit more in the statement. And like Lucy, I've had a doctor who was reprimanded by Council for prescribing paracetamol to himself. And the letter that he received included the line, self-prescribing medicines that are available over the counter for economic reasons may be considered a misuse of your standing as a medical professional, which I have to say was received with some astonishment by the member concerned at just how tut-tutty that did seem. And we've touched on this earlier, but the increasing trend of pharmacists reporting to doctors who prescribe for themselves or family, is this change in the statement going to potentially impact this trend? Anyone hazard a guess there?
Oh, who knows, I think is the answer there.
I think one of the things though about that statement about, exercise your clinical judgment when managing one-off minor ailments is that it does come under a heading that says where there is no practical alternative but to treat yourself and those close to you. That is the heading of that bit. And actually, so you've got to actually take that actually you can only consider your clinical judgment on managing one-off minor ailments in a situation when there is no practical alternative.
It's the exception. So if a GP appointment is available or the after hours is there and you can just sit down to them, that's,
To put a practical perspective on it, I don't think anyone is going to get in trouble for providing the sort of care that a parent provides. Putting a Band-Aid on a knee or putting moisturiser on eczema for your infant. None of this is what the council's aimed at. But as soon as you are putting a stitch in or prescribing anything, even Panadol, that's when you stop and think. And
So you think that if we had so you can buy 1% hydrocortisone over the counter, can't you, or 0.5% hydrocortisone over the counter? So you think, as a parent, I can go and buy that and put it on my child's eczema, but as a doctor, if I prescribe it to put on my child's eczema, that's crossed the line?
yes, I would say cross the line in the sense that it puts you at risk of being told off. Would you end up in front of a PCC for that kind of conduct? I don't think so. But if a particularly assiduous pharmacist saw that the prescription was for someone with your last name and reported you to the council, would the council write you a letter saying, we just don't condone doctors prescribing anything for family members where there is a practical alternative, i.e. take your child to their normal GP, please don't do it again? I think you probably would get a letter like that, as odd as that seems.
I think that for most of us, we would rather not get in trouble with the medical council, even if we get let off with an educational letter. It's still, I think, a huge shot across our bow when something like that happens. And so I think to buy something over the counter like Panadol makes more sense to me than prescribing it, because at the end of the day, it's only a few dollars. And I would rather do that, I think, than to face that letter.
Yeah, the $15 for the hydrocortisone cream
That's
that you
right.
can buy at the supermarket is probably $15 well spent if it avoids a medical council letter, isn't
That's
it?
right. That's right.
Compared with the time and emotional energy that you would spend in dealing with it, absolutely. So another area which has caused significant concern for our members is in rural areas of New Zealand. Finding adequate numbers of doctors is particularly challenging. And if you work in a small town with only 2 or 3 doctors, it's inevitable that you'll have patients who are also friends. Your family will have one of your colleagues as their doctor and will inevitably be part of the same social circle. Now, in previous statements, Council has attempted to recognise the difficulties that this creates, but I think with varying success. And it's apparently generated a lot of feedback to the Council as well. So, Sam, do you want to tell us what the new wording is under paragraphs 10 to 12 of the statement relating to rural situations?
Sure. Council states that you must ensure that any treatment you provide occurs in a professional or clinical setting. Be alert to relationships evolving over time and adopt a low threshold for referring these patients to another doctor for consultation, whether in person or by telehealth, or for seeking advice from colleagues. I had an inquiry, I think, late last year, where this was the situation for the doctor. She was working in a very remote place in New Zealand, and so she ended up having staff and their families as her patients. And I think she was finding it very difficult to navigate. I guess because if you think about it, and I've certainly heard of this, where you've got let's say the daughter of one of your colleagues is your patient, but your colleague is deeply involved in the treatment of the daughter. And this was an adult daughter in this particular case. And so you've got the doctor looking in the notes, wanting to order tests, telling the enrolled GP what to do. It becomes extremely difficult, I think. And I don't know, in that sort of situation, if you are treating a colleague, what sort of things do you think that our members should put in place?
So in some ways, there's almost a protection, isn't there, where giving advice about consulting other colleagues, getting a telehealth consultation, for example, or something like that, which would, in your situation, help get the other doctor off your poor doctor's back, really. But I think it certainly does allow some wriggle room, but it's also alerting the doctors in those situations that they've just got to be aware of the implications of the position that they're in and be aware of that slow trickle where something that might have been okay this year, in 2 years' time, the situation's changed enough that it's become a bit dubious. Lucy?
I was just thinking the telehealth services have kind of changed this a bit in that at least there is some availability to see a doctor in a remote area. even if you can't be examined, there is often some alternative there. I think the difficulty is when you have enrolled patients who are needing chronic ongoing care. And I think that the statements actually made it clear, and it's what the advice we always used to give, is that if you have a neighbour who is enrolled at your practice, it's fine to give her a script for trimethoprim for her UTI in a consultation. It's not fine to hand some trimethoprim over the back fence, that actually it's got to be in a clinical context. And I think we've always given that advice. And so it's nice to actually see the council has kind of clarified that you've got to just make sure you're dealing with things in a clinical context and in a clinical situation.
Yeah, and I think in the situation with the GP that spoke to me about this adult daughter and the father who was overly involved, I advise that you really do need firm boundaries. And I would advise the practices to have a strict policy in place at their practice so that all of the staff are aware, this is what we do, these are the boundaries. And if you can't abide by those boundaries, then perhaps you need to enrol somewhere else. And even if that means you're enrolling to a telehealth service. I think that's quite a good alternative. If you have a GP through a telehealth service, but one of the GPs in your clinic does the examination, then I think that's far safer, isn't it, for everybody?
And I think we've always advised practices not to have staff enrolled and their families enrolled. Just there's so many complications, medical certificates and
of course
all sorts of things. I think the best policy is don't do it.
Don't do it. I guess I'm thinking more of the remote, rural areas. I mean, in an urban centre, there's no need for that at all, although I'm sure it does still happen.
I think in that situation you described, Sam, it was crying out for a hard conversation.
Yes.
The staff member who was looking at notes of their adult child and being involved in care, it's not appropriate. And having a policy there would make the conversation easier because the rules are clear, but that would have to stop. If it's a remote enough place that there's no other option but for you to be the GP for your staff member's child, that's fine, but it needs to be on the basis that there's a confidence in that doctor-patient relationship and a clear boundary that the relation who also happens to be working in the practice is not going to be looking at those notes or seeking to involve themselves really in any way in the person's care.
Good. So we talked before about the list of must-nots that are listed in the statement. So these are things that you must not do for yourself, your family, or for those close to you. And it's worthwhile just listing these very quickly as a reminder. The first is you must not issue medical certificates. You must not do third-party assessments. So, for example, ACC. You must not provide psychotherapy. You must not provide ongoing management. So if a patient a family member who has hypertension, you must not continue long-term their treatment. You must not perform complex procedures. And there may be some debate about what constitutes a complex procedure or doesn't. Likewise, you must not perform sensitive examinations. You must not prescribe or administer medication with a risk of addiction, though as we mentioned, there is an exception to this. You must not prescribe controlled drugs, and you must not prescribe psychotropic medication. But again, under paragraph 14, there are some exceptions, and this includes the ability to prescribe antipsychotics or antidepressants to a patient who may come to harm if they miss a dose. So it's very short term and very much to cover that situation. But it is also kind of a helpful addition to remove some of the uncertainty that existed under the previous statement where the exception was not explicit. So there's been some debate about how much change this really is. I think it's still a little bit of pragmatism to the real world of working as a doctor, particularly in remote communities. I think the recent changes bring us a little more into line with what I've seen from international standards, so that's good for countries that are similar to us. But the bottom line is, MPS's advice is that you carefully read all of the relevant medical council statements, and particularly this one, and especially if you're new to practice in New Zealand. And this podcast has by no means covered all of the relevant information that is in the statement on treating yourself and those close to you. So, final thoughts, team, on the new statement and what that means for our members.
Well, I'm hopeful that this is a softening in council's stance.
And I'll be the naysayer. I certainly think it's an improvement in terms of being explicit and clearer about what is expected. But in terms of what gets notified and what earns a telling off and what earns further investigation, I'm not sure that there's a massive movement towards leniency. Certainly, if someone wanted a very quick version of advice from me about providing care to yourself or those close to you, I would say just don't do it unless it's really an emergency and you have to. Because while there are exceptions and rules you can point to justify your actions, it is it's just easier at a personal and professional level to have a bright line that you don't go over and unless you're faced with something that's genuinely an emergency, like the need to provide another 5 days cover for someone's SSRI until they can get another appointment.
Lucy?
Yeah, you see, I think that the likelihood is that we are still going to be getting these cases coming in, that we are still going to be getting doctors criticised for treating themselves and their family. I think it's a common issue, and I don't want to be giving the impression in this podcast that it's that's not going to happen anymore. I think it clearly is. I do think it's clearer. I think it's nice to know that there are some situations, especially that when someone can't get an appointment, that you can actually give some SSRIs for a few days if it's an emergency and the patient's going to withdraw. I think that's nice. But yeah, I wouldn't like to give the impression that means that there's actually going to be any leniency if you do breach the statement, and that whole thing about when there is no practical alternative, that's going to be a hard thing to argue with all the telehealth services available these days.
So serious cases are still going to be serious cases and they'll be treated exactly the same, but there might be a little more wriggle room around the minor edges that might soften things slightly. Is that a potential summary? But I like Adam's advice. Don't do it as the starting point, and it's only as an absolute exception that you'd think of doing it. Thank you all for listening to this podcast, and I hope it's been helpful. Our next podcast will be covering what to do about looking for cases for teaching purposes and do I need consent? And I hope you'll tune in for that. We look forward to catching up with you on our next podcast. And if you like these medical protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, we'll be happy to look at that. Please email us on nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org.